Remove the brake caliper adapter bolts. Remove the brake caliper assemblies. Do not hang the calipers by their hoses. Instead, attach the calipers to the axle with a hook or wire. Use a 15mm socket to remove the axle shaft bolts. Before removing your axle shaft, place an oil catch pan under the end of the hub. Separate the axle shaft from the hub using a brass drift or soft-faced hammer. Remove the axle shaft. Blow out the hub bolt holes with compressed air. When removing the spindle nut, apply inward pressure to the QT 1019I or similar spindle nut socket to disengage the ratcheting components of the hub nut. Remove the spindle nut. Remove the outer wheel bearing and wheel hub assembly. Pry out the wheel seal. Remove the inner wheel bearing. If you need to replace either the hub or the rotor, remove the 8 rotor to hub bolts. Separate the rotor from the hub. Drive out the outer bearing cup. Turn the hub over and drive out the inner bearing cup. Clean and inspect the parts. A spindle nut that has separated is no longer serviceable and must be replaced. Clean the spindle surfaces. Clean the rotor if it will be reused. Place the rotor on the hub and line up the bolt holes. If you are reusing the rotor to hub bolts, apply 242 blue thread locker to the bolt threads. Install the rotor to hub bolts. Torque the rotor bolts to 114 pound-feet or 155 Newton meters in a crisscross pattern. Ford used 2 different inner bearing cups for 1999 to 2016 F350 Dana 80 dual rear wheel axles. For 1999 to 2004 and 2006.5 to 2016, use QU 50396 cup and QT 1804 installer. For 2005 to 2006.5, use QU 50646 cup in QT 1806 installer. Use the correct inner bearing cup installer and a QT 1100 series driver handle to drive in or press in the inner bearing cup. Use QT 1801 bearing cup installer and a QT 1100 series driver handle to drive in or press in the outer bearing cup. Verify the bearing cups are fully seated. Clean the bearing cups and hub bores. Coat the inside of the hub and the bearing cup surfaces with synthetic gear lubricant. Use QT 5500 bearing packer to pack the bearings with NLGI number 2 grease. Push down on the center of the packer until clean grease completely fills the voids between the bearing rollers. Remove the bearings from the packer and use the excess grease to cover the rollers and cage. When finished, place the pack bearing on a clean towel. For very large diameter bearings, like the 2005 to 2006.5 inner that will not fit in the QT 5500 packer, you can use a grease gun equipped with a needle adapter to pack the bearing. Remember to use the excess grease to coat the outside of the bearing and the bearing cup. Place the packed inner wheel bearing in the inner wheel bearing cup. Ford used two different wheel seals for 1999 to 2016 Dana 80 F350 dual rear wheel axles. For 1999 to 2004 and 2006.5 to 2016 axles, use Seal Installer QT1503 and QU40449 seal. For 2005 to 2006.5, use QT1545 seal installer and QU40555 seal. Attach the seal to the seal installer and place the seal in the hub. Drive the seal into place with a QT1100 series driver handle and a hammer. Lubricate the seal inner ring with clean oil or grease. Tape the end of the spindle threads. Lightly coat the spindle seal surface with clean gear lubricant. Carefully install the hub and rotor assembly onto the spindle. Remove the tape from the spindle. Install the packed outer wheel bearing. Line up the tab on the spindle nut with the key slot in the spindle. Start the spindle nut onto the spindle threads. When adjusting the spindle nut, always remember to apply inward pressure against your wrench to disengage the nut ratchet mechanism. While rotating the wheel hub to seat the bearings, use QT 1019I socket or similar tool to torque the spindle nut to 70 pound-feet or 95 Newton meters. Back off the nut 1/4 turn. Retorque the spindle nut to 18 pound-feet or 24 Newton meters. Use a QT 1263 hub torque plate and an inch-pound torque wrench to measure your hub rotating torque. The rotating torque cannot exceed 20 inch-pounds or 2.3 Newton meters. And the hub end play must be 0.000 of an inch. Lightly coat a new QU20084 O-ring with clean oil or grease. Install the O-ring on the axle shaft. Install the axle shaft. Line up the axle shaft and hub bolt holes. Install new QU42308 axle shaft to hub bolts. Tighten the bolts in a crisscross pattern. Torque the bolts in a crisscross pattern to 98 pound-feet or 133 Newton meters. Using new bolts, install the caliper assemblies. Torque the bolts to 128 pound-feet for 1999 to 2004 or 203 pound-feet for 2005 to 2016. Still need more info? See our free, interactive TorqueKing.com exploded views for Ford Dana 80 dual rear wheel hubs. XV272 covers 1999 to 2004. XV271 covers 2005 to 2006.5. XV273 is for 2006.5 to 2016. Each exploded view includes application-specific exploded view, hub service procedures, torque specs, lube recommendations, plus available kits and more.